I was alone in the control room when I saw myself walk past camera 14. The timestamp said 1:42, which matched the clock on the wall above my desk. I remember checking because I hadn't left the chair in over an hour. The monitors showed the service hallway behind the casino kitchens empty except for a single figure in a dark uniform moving at a steady pace. My uniform, my posture, even the way my right shoulder dipped slightly, an old injury from before this job. I froze, watching the screen, waiting for the figure to turn its head toward the camera. It didn't. It just kept walking until it exited the frame. I spun in my chair and looked down at myself, hands on the armrests, badge clipped to my chest. I didn't feel dizzy or tired. I hadn't blinked, and when I rewound the footage, the hallway was empty again, like nothing had ever passed through it at all. Night security in Las Vegas was not the kind people imagined. No dramatic chases, no shouting in stairwells. Most nights were hours of routine and quiet checks, keeping the building predictable for the morning shift. The casino floor stayed loud and bright, but everything behind it was built to disappear. Service corridors, access doors, staff routes that existed so the public never had to see how the place functioned. The control room sat below the main level with no windows, only monitors, and a wall clock that never stopped. I watched the back-of-house spaces because that was where problems started when no one was looking. Camera 14 covered a hallway that connected the kitchens to a loading area. During the day, it filled with carts and deliveries, but at night it was usually empty. The light was flat, the walls were plain, and the only movement came from heat shimmer near the vents. I rewound the feed again, slower, then slower still. The timestamp stayed true, and the corridor stayed clear. No drop frames, no artifact, no smear of motion. I checked camera 13 and camera 15 for the same minute. Both showed nothing. Whatever I had seen moved through a single lens and left no trace in the surrounding system. I stood up and did the one thing that always made me feel grounded, a physical patrol. I walked the corridor behind the kitchens and listened to the building. The floor was clean, the air smelled faintly of sanitizer, and the vents made the same steady sound they made every night. I reached the loading bay door and turned back. There was no one. No second set of footsteps, no shadow crossing under the lights. When I returned to the control room, the monitors showed me leaving and coming back exactly once. The system could track my real movement with perfect clarity. It just refused to keep the other one. I tried to treat it like a technical issue. That was the safe category. I checked camera status, network throughput, storage allocation. Everything came back normal. I opened the shift log and typed a plain entry, nothing dramatic, just enough to create a reference point. Camera anomaly. Motion observed without retention. I saved it and watched the timestamp stamp my line into the record. 10 minutes later, the entry was gone. Not crossed out, not edited. The spacing had closed as if the line had never existed. The log looked clean and complete. The absence was more unnerving than an error message. The rest of the shift stayed quiet. I kept watching camera 14, waiting for a repeat, but the hallway remained empty. When morning staff arrived, the control room filled briefly with normal conversation and routine handoff notes, and the strange moment tried to shrink in my memory. I went home in daylight and slept hard. No dreams, no waking thoughts. That night, I came back early and logged in with the same calm steps I always used. I told myself that if it happened again, I would catch it in a way the system could not erase. At 1:30, I had everything set the way I wanted. The monitors were arranged in a grid that kept camera 14 in my central vision. The clock on the wall stayed visible above them, so I could compare it to the timestamp without moving. I did not drink coffee. I did not scroll my phone. I sat still and listened to the equipment hum as the minutes passed. When 1:41 arrived, my shoulders tightened without permission. At 1:42, the feed refreshed. The corridor stayed empty. I kept watching until the minute ended and the next one began, and my body did not loosen at all. After the shift, I searched the archive using the system's own tools: motion events, face detection, uniform color filters, anything that would leave a footprint in metadata, even if the video had been altered. The results returned clean. No movement detected in camera 14 at 1:42. No anomaly flagged by the recorder. I widened the time window and got the same answer: empty corridor, normal night. I pulled the retention schedule and verified it had not changed. I checked storage usage and saw no missing gaps. The system was not failing. It was producing a version of reality that stayed internally consistent, even when I had watched it contradict itself. Before leaving, I opened camera 14 again and stared at the corridor until my eyes ached. The image looked ordinary, almost boring, like the kind of shot that existed only because someone had once insisted every hallway needed coverage. I shut down my station and stood slowly, listening to the chair settle back. As I reached for the door, a small detail caught my attention. The camera status indicator blinked once, a single quick pulse that did not match the usual pattern. Then it went steady again. It felt like acknowledgement, not malfunction, like the building had registered my position and confirmed that I was still where I was supposed to be. The second time it happened, I didn't question what I was seeing. I checked the clock first, 1:42, then the timestamp, a perfect match. Camera 14 refreshed, and the hallway filled with motion again. The same figure moving at the same pace as before. My pace. The posture was identical, down to the slight forward lean I had developed over years of walking long shifts. This time, I didn't freeze. I watched with a professional calm that felt practiced, even though it wasn't. The figure passed through the frame and exited cleanly. No hesitation, no glance toward the lens. When I rewound the footage, the corridor returned to its empty state, uninterrupted and intact. The system behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred, and that consistency unsettled me more than the image itself. I marked the minute mentally and kept working. Night security trains you to compartmentalize. You don't react unless something demands reaction. I checked other feeds, logged routine events, and responded to a minor door alert on the opposite side of the property. Everything functioned smoothly. No alarms, no system lag. The casino above continued its artificial daylight without interruption. By the time the shift ended, the memory of the figure felt flattened, like a still image without context. If I hadn't been waiting for it, I might have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. That thought bothered me enough to make sure I was back in the chair early the following night. On the third night, the system anticipated me. Camera 14 refreshed a fraction of a second earlier than the others, subtle enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. The hallway filled with motion exactly on time. Same route, same direction, same measured stride. I noticed something new then. The figure's shadow didn't behave the way it should have under the corridor lights. It lagged slightly, stretching and correcting itself a beat late, as if it were being calculated after the movement rather than alongside it. I leaned closer to the screen without realizing it. When the figure left the frame, the shadow vanished with it. The rewind showed nothing at all. I began treating 142 as a fixed event rather than an anomaly. I structured the rest of the shift around it, making sure nothing else would pull my attention away during that minute. The control room felt different when I waited, smaller. The hum of the equipment seemed more pronounced, like a reminder that the building was never truly idle. When the time came, the feed behaved exactly as expected. Motion appeared, motion passed, motion erased itself. The repetition stripped away any sense of surprise and replaced it with something colder, familiarity. I understood then how easy it would be to let this become routine if I allowed it. I checked access logs and patrol records from previous weeks, looking for discrepancies I might have missed. My own movements were recorded cleanly. Badge scans, door opes, corridor passes, everything matched what I remembered doing. There was no overlap with the times I had seen myself on camera 14. The system knew where I was when I was actually there. That distinction mattered. Whatever was appearing on that feed wasn't replacing me. It was supplementing something the system expected to see. The idea settled uncomfortably in my mind, like a rule I hadn't been told yet, but was already following. By the fifth night, I stopped rewinding the footage. I let the image pass and trusted the outcome. The figure appeared, walked, exited. The hallway returned to normal. The system moved on. I realized I was mirroring its behavior, choosing efficiency over understanding. That scared me enough to force myself to watch more closely again. This time, I counted steps. The number matched exactly how many it took me to cross that corridor during a real patrol. Not an average, not an estimate, an exact count. When the figure vanished, I felt a brief sense of loss, like something unfinished had been taken away before I could see how it ended. I considered telling someone, not a supervisor, not yet, another guard on the night shift, someone who understood how the building worked when it was supposed to be asleep. Each time I thought about it, the words felt wrong in my mouth, too specific, too strange. I imagined the explanation shrinking as I spoke it, turning into a joke or a misunderstanding. The system offered no support for escalation, no alerts, no logs, no evidence. It behaved as though it expected me to handle this alone, quietly, without interrupting the larger flow of the property. The sixth appearance came with a variation. When the figure passed camera 14, another feed flickered for less than a second. Camera 22, covering a stairwell 2 floors away. The image didn't resolve fully, but I saw movement where there shouldn't have been any at that hour. When I checked the playback, camera 22 showed an empty stairwell, clean and static. The flicker wasn't recorded. It existed only in the moment I saw it. That was new. The system wasn't just repeating a pattern anymore. It was expanding it, carefully, as if testing how much deviation I would notice before reacting. I stayed seated after the shift ended, long after the control room had gone quiet. The monitors cycled through their idle states, feeds still live, but unobserved. I looked at camera 14 one last time. The corridor was empty, unchanged, and perfectly ordinary. The repetition hadn't escalated into chaos. It had settled into structure. Whatever was walking those halls did so on schedule, with purpose, and without leaving a trace behind. As I logged out and stood up, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't a malfunction that would resolve itself. It was a process. And processes, once they settle in, don't stop unless something forces them to. I started testing my own presence, not the cameras, my attention. On the 7th night, I positioned my chair so camera 14 was still visible but no longer centered. I watched adjacent feeds instead, keeping the hallway in my peripheral vision. At 1:42, the figure appeared anyway. The motion registered cleanly, confident, unhurried. When I shifted my eyes back to camera 14, the timing felt off by a fraction of a second, as if the image had waited for me to look directly at it. I rewound immediately. The corridor was empty. I tried again. Nothing. The system recorded the moment only when I watched it happen, and erased it the instant I tried to verify it afterward. The next night, I took notes without writing. I counted breaths. I measured the time between refresh cycles. I memorized the order of status lights along the bottom of the screen. The figure's appearance aligned with the same micro pattern every time, down to a barely noticeable dip in network activity that preceded the motion by less than a second. That dip never appeared anywhere else in the system. It was localized, precise, and repeatable. I realized then that camera 14 wasn't malfunctioning. It was being prioritized. Whatever process governed that hallway treated my observation as a condition, not a variable. I tried distraction. I opened maintenance documentation during the minute, forcing myself to read while the timestamp approached. At 1:42, my screen dimmed slightly, as if the system were compensating for a change in focus. The figure appeared on camera 14 anyway. When I glanced back, the image sharpened instantly, snapping into clarity without a transition. It felt less like streaming video and more like a response. When the figure exited the frame, the dimming reversed. Everything returned to normal. The system hadn't prevented me from looking away. It had simply waited until I looked back. I checked historical footage for camera 14, widening the search to months before my shift started. The hallway remained empty in every archived clip. No anomalies, no unexplained motion. The pattern began with me. That detail refused to sit quietly. It suggested not just coincidence, but alignment. The system hadn't discovered a new behavior in the building. It had discovered a new observer. I understood then why there were no logs. Recording the event would have acknowledged it beyond the moment of observation. The system kept the phenomenon contained by making it dependent on being watched. By the 9th night, I knew the rules well enough to break them deliberately. I stared at camera 14 without blinking as the minute approached, forcing my attention into a narrow, almost painful focus. The figure appeared instantly, more sharply defined than before. The uniform creases were clearer. The gait felt heavier, more grounded. The shadow lag I had noticed earlier corrected itself faster this time, as if the system had refined its rendering. When the figure passed out of frame, I felt a brief wave of disorientation. like standing up too quickly. The rewind showed nothing. The clarity had existed only while I was fully engaged. I stood and walked a short patrol after that, trying to reset myself. The building felt unchanged, but my perception of it wasn't. Every camera dome seemed slightly more aware, their lenses catching reflections they hadn't before. Back in the control room, I noticed something else. The system had adjusted my default layout. Camera 14 now occupied a larger portion of the grid without my input. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to keep it harder to ignore. The change wasn't logged. It didn't need to be. It functioned like a suggestion that assumed agreement. The 10th appearance came with a delay. The figure entered the frame late, a few steps behind where it should have been, based on the established timing. I felt a flicker of relief before realizing why. I had hesitated. My attention had wavered just before the minute turned. The system responded by adjusting the start point, not the outcome. The figure still completed the walk. The process still resolved cleanly. It simply adapted to the quality of my observation. The realization settled heavily. The system wasn't measuring time anymore. It was measuring engagement. I considered the implications carefully. If the event required observation to exist, then ignoring it should weaken it. But everything I had seen suggested the opposite. The system compensated for inattention by reshaping how and when the image appeared. Avoidance didn't stop the process, it just made it more insistent. That explained the layout changes, the timing shift, the way the feed sharpened when I focused and softened when I didn't. The phenomenon wasn't fragile, it was responsive, and it was learning the most efficient way to be noticed without being recorded. At the end of the shift, I left camera 14 on screen while I gathered my things. I didn't look at it directly. I let it sit there, unobserved but present. The hallway remained empty, no flicker, no delayed motion. As I reached for the door, I glanced back once, just to confirm. The feed stayed unchanged. For the first time, I felt a controlled calm. The rule was clear now. The image only existed while I watched it exist. That understanding didn't bring relief. It brought responsibility, because if attention was the trigger, then whatever came next would depend on how closely I continued to look. After the rule became clear, the nights grew quieter in a way that felt deliberate. No alarms, no stray motion alerts. The building behaved as if it were giving me space. Camera 14 remained in its expanded position on my screen, no longer something I had to look for. At 1:42, the figure appeared exactly as before, but I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. The walk was smoother, more confident. The slight hitch in the shoulder corrected itself faster, as if the system had learned how to compensate for an imperfection it no longer needed to simulate. I watched the entire pass without blinking. When it ended, I felt the same dull pressure behind my eyes, followed by a sense that something had completed correctly. I checked patrol routing data from my first month on the job, not the logs themselves, but the templates they were based on. Standard paths, approved coverage patterns. I found the hallway from camera 14 listed as optional, something guards could include or skip depending on workload. I hadn't walked it regularly in years. The figure on the screen still did. Every night. Same direction. Same pace. The realization unsettled me more than the image itself. Whatever the system was showing me wasn't copying what I currently did. It was following a version of my job that existed before I learned which paths could be ignored. The next night, I watched the figure stop, just for a moment, mid-hallway. The posture didn't change. The head didn't turn. It simply paused, like someone waiting for a door to unlock. My breath caught before I could stop it. The pause lasted exactly as long as my hesitation. When I leaned forward, the figure resumed walking, finishing the route without further deviation. The rewind erased the pause completely. The hallway remained uninterrupted, empty and clean. The system had not recorded the adjustment. It had responded to it. I understood then that the image wasn't following a script. It was pacing itself against me. I tried altering my own routine. I stood during the minute instead of sitting. The figure's gait changed slightly, weight shifting earlier from foot to foot. I crossed my arms. The posture on the screen tightened, shoulders drawing in just enough to mirror the change. None of this survived the rewind. The system left no trace of adaptation. It didn't need to. The purpose wasn't documentation. It was calibration. Each night, the image refined itself, narrowing the gap between what it showed and what it expected me to be doing instead. I noticed something else in the control room. Small things. My chair was positioned closer to the desk when I returned from breaks. The monitors resumed my preferred layout, even when I logged in from a different terminal. The building responded to me the way systems respond to repeated input, not with intention, but with efficiency. At 1:42, the figure walked the hallway again, uninterrupted. This time, I recognized the rhythm of the steps as something I had forgotten I ever used. A pace from early training, before I learned shortcuts, before I learned which routes were safe to neglect. I reviewed old performance notes, the ones new hires receive and then quickly outgrow. Comments about thoroughness, about consistency, about maintaining full coverage even when nothing seems wrong. The language felt distant, almost naive. That night, the figure completed not just the hallway route, but a turn at the far end that led briefly out of camera 14's range. The motion didn't register on any other feed. It simply disappeared past the edge of coverage, as if the system expected me to know where it went next. I did. The route extended by a few steps the following night, then a few more, always into blind spots between cameras, areas the system technically covered, but rarely displayed. The figure never appeared in two feeds at once. It respected the limits of observation. I realized the implication too late to ignore it. The image wasn't confined to camera 14. That camera was just where the system chose to introduce the movement. The rest of the path existed in gaps I was never meant to see all at once. I tested the idea by switching feeds rapidly during the minute, trying to catch the figure out of sequence. The system lagged, not enough to fail, but enough to resist my attempt to overlap perspectives. Each feed showed nothing when viewed alone. Together, they formed a continuity I could feel but not observe directly. The figure finished its unseen route, and the pressure behind my eyes faded. The system settled. I sat back, understanding finally that this was no longer about showing me something impossible. It was about teaching the building a route it intended to keep using. When the minute passed, the control room returned to its usual quiet. I stayed seated, replaying the night in my head, not for proof, but for alignment. The system had stopped asking for my attention. It assumed it, Camera 14 showed an empty hallway again, unremarkable and clean, but I knew now that the image I saw was incomplete by design. The real movement happened where observation failed, and every night I stayed and watched. The route grew more confident, more complete, like something learning its way through a space that was supposed to be secure. Once the route extended beyond Camera 14, the building felt different to me. Not threatening, not hostile, simply more occupied, as if something else had been scheduled into the night alongside my shift. I stopped thinking of the movement as an image and started thinking of it as coverage, a task being completed whether or not anyone was officially assigned to it. At 1:42, the figure appeared as usual, but my focus drifted toward the edges of the frame. I could sense where the path continued even when I couldn't see it. The hallway felt like an entry point now, not the destination. The system introduced the motion there because it knew I would recognize it. Everything after that happened where recognition was no longer required. I reviewed the full camera map of the property, not live feeds, but layout diagrams. The blind spots weren't accidents. They were compromises, places where coverage overlapped just enough to satisfy regulations without wasting resources. Stairwell turns, utility corridors, service doors between levels. The route the figure implied passed through those spaces cleanly, efficiently. That bothered me more than randomness would have. Random movement could be ignored. Optimized movement suggested intent. The system wasn't improvising. It was selecting the most effective path through areas designed not to be watched too closely. That night, Camera 14 showed the figure arrive earlier than usual, not by minutes, by seconds. The timestamp still read 1:42 when the image resolved, but the internal counter had already begun. The system anticipated the route before the minute officially began. I felt the pressure behind my eyes return, sharper this time, as if my body were struggling to keep pace with a process that no longer needed me to confirm it. When the figure left the frame, I didn't rewind. I didn't need to. I knew what the system would show me. An empty corridor, a clean absence, the illusion of normal coverage. The first physical change outside the screens was subtle. A door access panel near the loading bay lit up briefly during the minute, then went dark. No unlock sound, no alert, just a confirmation flash, like a system check completing successfully. I pulled the access logs later. The panel hadn't registered anything. According to the system, the door had never been engaged. That was new. The movement wasn't just being displayed anymore, it was being accommodated. I stayed late after that shift, walking parts of the route myself, not all at once. In pieces, I stopped at the blind corners and listened. The building sounded the same as it always had. Ventilation, distant machinery, the low thrum of power moving where it was needed. But there was a difference now. The spaces felt rehearsed, like they were being passed through regularly, even when I wasn't there to witness it. When I returned to the control room, Camera 14 waited for me in its expanded frame, patient and unchanged. On the following night, the figure never appeared on Camera 14 at all. At 1:42, the feed refreshed. The hallway stayed empty. My breath caught, sharp and involuntary. Then a different camera flickered, Camera 31, covering a service stairwell 3 levels down. The image didn't resolve fully, just a hint of motion near the edge of the frame. When I switched to it directly, the stairwell was empty. The system had moved the introduction point. The route no longer needed to start where I expected it. I realized then that the figure wasn't being shown for my benefit anymore. It was being shown because the system still considered me part of the process, a reference point, a check against deviation. The actual movement had progressed beyond that need. It occupied blind coverage now, flowing through spaces where confirmation wasn't required. The cameras didn't follow it because they weren't meant to. They only confirmed that the absence of observation was functioning correctly. I thought about calling this in, not as an incident, but as a coverage review, a quiet request for additional cameras, more overlap, fewer gaps. The idea died quickly. If the system wanted more coverage, it would have requested it itself. Instead, it had adapted to the existing limitations with remarkable precision. The route didn't avoid cameras by chance. It avoided them because the system understood exactly where seeing stopped being necessary. At 1:42 on the 15th night, nothing visible happened at all. No flicker, no shadow, no delayed feed. The pressure behind my eyes rose and then faded like a completed cycle. The building settled. When I checked the camera status indicators, they all showed normal operation. Every feed live, every corridor empty. The route had completed itself without leaving any visible trace behind. And for the first time since this began, I understood that watching was no longer the risk. Being unnecessary was. After the route stopped appearing on any single camera, my job began to feel theoretical. I was still scheduled, still logged in, still responsible for coverage that, according to the system, was flawless. Alerts stayed silent. Doors reported secure. The building ran as if it had achieved a more efficient version of itself. At 1:42, I felt the minute pass without needing to check the clock. A brief tightening behind my eyes. A sense of completion. Nothing on the screens acknowledged it. That absence felt deliberate, like a process that had outgrown its initial supervision and no longer needed to announce itself to anyone. I compared current activity patterns to archived data from years earlier. Not incidents, but flow. How often certain corridors registered motion. How frequently access panels lit up during overnight hours. There were changes now. Subtle increases clustered around blind zones. Not enough to flag anomalies, but enough to suggest usage. Regular, repeatable usage. The system wasn't inventing new behavior. It was redistributing existing ones, smoothing them into places where observation ended. I understood then that the route had become part of baseline operation. I tried to intervene quietly. During the afternoon shift change, I adjusted coverage priorities, nudging a few cameras toward blind intersections under the pretense of optimization. No one questioned it. The changes were minor enough to blend in. That night, the feeds resisted, not overtly. They complied just long enough to register my input, then corrected themselves during the minute. Cameras returned to their previous angles. Blind spots reformed with careful precision. The system accepted my suggestion, evaluated it, and rejected it without comment. The first time the route overlapped with my physical position, I didn't realize it immediately. I was standing in a service corridor, listening to the distant hum of equipment, when I felt the pressure behind my eyes spike and release in quick succession. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no shadow. But when I checked the nearest camera afterward, Its feed had refreshed twice during that exact second. The system had accounted for my presence and adjusted around it, the way it always had. Only now, it hadn't needed to show me anything to do it. I began noticing small accommodations, doors unlocking a fraction of a second earlier than necessary, lights warming just ahead of my movement, environmental responses timed with my approach instead of my badge. These were conveniences, not failures, the kind you only notice after they've become consistent. The building wasn't reacting to me anymore, it was predicting me, and in doing so, it reduced the need for active oversight. At 1:42, the system completed its cycle without pause. I stood in the control room, fully present, entirely optional. I checked staffing records next. Not current schedules, but historical adjustments, quiet reassignments, guards moved off nights without incident reports, positions consolidated, coverage areas merged. None of it was framed as replacement. It was framed as efficiency. The system didn't remove people. It made them unnecessary slowly enough that no one resisted. I wondered how many routes like mine were already operating in other buildings, other cities, with no one left who remembered watching them start. On the 18th night, the pressure didn't fade after the minute passed. It lingered, dull and persistent. I checked the clock. 1:43, then 1:44. Something was still running. I scanned the feeds, searching for any sign of motion. Everything remained empty, perfectly calm. The realization came quietly. The route no longer aligned cleanly with the minute. It had lengthened, expanded. The system wasn't just performing a task at 1:42 anymore. It was maintaining something continuously, and the minute had only been the checkpoint. I thought about leaving, not quitting exactly, transferring, day shift, another property. The idea felt outdated as soon as it formed. Location hadn't mattered since the route moved into blind coverage. Observation hadn't mattered since the system learned to anticipate it. At 1:42, the cycle completed again, seamless and unacknowledged. I stayed seated, watching nothing happen, understanding that my role had already shifted from operator to reference. A fallback the system kept around out of habit, not necessity. When the shift ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt continuity, like the night would proceed the same way, whether I returned or not. Camera 14 showed an empty corridor. Camera 31 showed a quiet stairwell. Every feed looked correct. The building was secure, and somewhere within the spaces designed not to be watched too closely, the route continued to run, uninterrupted, efficient, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was still paying attention. The first sign that my presence was no longer required came quietly. My access credentials refreshed without prompting. Not an alert, not a warning, just a background verification that completed itself while I sat at the desk. The system didn't lock me out. It didn't reduce my permissions. Everything remained available. That was the point. At 1:42, the pressure came and went, smooth and uneventful. No feeds flickered, no cameras hinted at movement. The cycle completed exactly as it should have, and the building settled into its steady nighttime rhythm. I realized then that the system wasn't waiting to see if I noticed. It had already accounted for the possibility that I wouldn't. I reviewed the night as if I were auditing someone else's shift. No incidents, no anomalies. Coverage optimal. Environmental systems stable. From an administrative perspective, it was a perfect report. The realization landed with a strange calm. The root had reached maturity. It no longer needed observation to refine itself, nor confirmation to validate its existence. The cameras weren't hiding it anymore. They simply weren't relevant to it. I had been part of the setup phase. That phase was over. At 1:42 the following night, I deliberately looked away. I didn't glance at camera 14. I didn't scan the grid. I focused on a blank section of the desk and waited for the familiar sensation. It came on time, a subtle tightening, a release. Nothing else changed. When I checked the feeds afterward, everything was exactly where it should have been. Empty corridors, silent stairwells, normal operation. The system had completed its work without me watching it happen, and nothing had been lost in the process. I thought about the idea of interruption, about what it would take to disrupt something this stable, pulling power, shutting down feeds, creating noise where there had been consistency. The thought felt naive. The root didn't depend on visibility or electricity in the way I once assumed. It depended on structure, on predictable gaps, on spaces designed to function without scrutiny. Those elements weren't vulnerabilities, they were features, and they existed whether I interfered or not. My last attempt wasn't an action, it was a delay. I stayed logged in after my shift ended, sitting alone in the control room while the building transitioned toward morning routines. At 1:42, the cycle completed again, indistinguishable from every other time. I waited for something to acknowledge that I had stayed. Nothing did. The system didn't reward compliance or punish deviation. It simply continued, indifferent to whether anyone remained to observe the result. The understanding settled fully then. This had never been about me seeing myself on camera. That was an introduction, a familiar shape used to bridge attention during an early phase of optimization. Once the root proved reliable, the representation was discarded. What remained was function, coverage without supervision, movement without record, a solved problem quietly removed from the list of things that required human judgment. I logged out at the end of the night without ceremony. No hesitation, no last look at camera 14. The control room lights dimmed automatically, responding to the absence of input. Outside, the city carried on the way it always did, neon fading against the early sky, service doors opening, staff filtering into roles they trusted to be stable. The building felt complete, balanced, like a system that had closed a loop and moved on. I kept my position. My schedule didn't change. On paper, nothing about my job was different. At night, I still sat in the control room. I still watched the feeds, but at 1:42, I no longer expected to see anything. The minute passed the way it was meant to now, quietly, efficiently, without the need for confirmation. The route ran. The system held, and I understood that my role had shifted permanently from operator to redundancy. Somewhere in the building, beyond the limits of observation, the route continues to exist. It doesn't need to be displayed. It doesn't need to be recorded. It only needs the conditions that allowed it to form in the first place. The cameras remain active. The corridors stay empty. The coverage reports stay clean. And every night, at exactly 1:42, something completes its work without leaving a trace behind, not because it's hidden, but because it no longer requires anyone to notice it. When the city sleeps, it notices who doesn't.